Are my lips too overdrawn today? Maybe. But we're gonna roll with it. Hello there, it's Bianca from the Closet Historian, and today I want to talk about how to start wearing vintage style. So vintage style or vintage inspired style, whichever you really want to go with. I think some people are kind of nitpicky about vintage being wearing true vintage clothing, but you know, that's not accessible for everyone. So for me, vintage or vintage inspired style, they're kind of just interchangeable. I know everyone has their own definitions of these kind of thing, but vintage is such a broad term anyway that I think we can use it loosely now if we would like. So these are just kind of some steps on how to start wearing vintage style, or at least how I started wearing vintage style. And step one, of course, is research, which is the most fun step as far as I'm concerned, and you never get past step one, it only continues. You will always be researching vintage style because once you fall down that rabbit hole, there's no coming back. There's just so many avenues to go down when you start researching vintage style. But if you are just starting to change your wardrobe into a more vintage inspired wardrobe and style, then it's really good to start yourself a Pinterest board. And once you've built up your Pinterest board a little bit, you can start to narrow down kind of the eras that you're most interested in. And then you can go to other research materials like films from that time or books about that era and that style from that era. There are lots of great reference books that are available. I usually pick them up on Amazon, but you might be able to find them at your local bookstore or just from the library, or sometimes they're even uploaded online. You can find entire books just about sewing or beauty or different things from one particular era. So if you figure out that you're mostly interested in 20s things, you can look for reference books on 1920s fashion. If you're mostly into 1940s things, you can look into 1940s fashion books or catalogs, things like that. So research is the number one thing. Once you know what you want, you have to learn about what you want, right? Of course. Step two, after you've started your research into vintage style or the kind of vintage style you are most interested in, is to go through your current wardrobe and see what of your clothes that you already have will work for vintage styles and what won't work for that. So most items, I think you are able, because you're gonna have this sort of like modern vintage fusion when you start, because no one can afford to throw out their whole closet when they start switching and kind of transferring their style. If you have basics in your wardrobe, those are gonna transfer into a vintage style really easily. Things like a black pencil skirt or a little black dress are gonna be easy to style in a more vintage way. Just wearing your makeup and hair in a more vintage style is gonna make those items look vintage to start with, just because they are items that we still have in our closets today that are kind of originate from the 40s and 50s. Pencil skirts, things like that kind of came out of those eras and just hung around. So anything like that you have in your wardrobe is gonna be really great and easy to work into your vintage wardrobe as you move forward. So once you've gone through your wardrobe and identified things that will work for vintage style, or will at least work for now until you can replace them with more authentic or period specific items later, you of course have also identified, naturally, holes in your wardrobe. Places where you are missing things. Maybe you're missing dresses and you have separates, or vice versa, or maybe you have some summery things but not enough winter things. Different pieces are gonna add a lot more versatility into your wardrobe. So you wanna create step three, I would say. Step three is to create a wish list of items that you want for your new vintage inspired style. So maybe you need some pencil skirts, which are pretty big basic in the 40s and 50s style arena. Or maybe you would like some more Art Deco shaped things, more like drop waist 20s style dresses, because you wanna be more deco in style. And you're just kind of going to be identifying pieces that are missing from your closet. And I think it's good to keep a wish list of those items. That way, when you're on a budget maybe, or, I mean, most people are on a budget, but if you're not, go for it. Fill all those holes all at once. Go crazy. For most of us, we're on a budget. And so we're going to have to be kind of keeping a prioritized list, I think, of what to add next when it's payday or it's your birthday or whatever, to facilitate your vintage style more. Another thing to keep in mind when going through your wardrobe is, of course, accessories as well, and you're probably gonna have a separate kind of wish list of all different accessories you'd like, whether it's shoes, hats, handbags. They really help complete the vintage look, especially if you're going for something a bit more authentic in style. Things like gloves, hats are really gonna add to the authentic vibes and really help you look more like your Pinterest images that you've chosen earlier. Images of actresses or regular people from back in the day. You can see how they styled their items and what kind of shoes, bags, hats they wore with them, and get an idea for what you might like to add to your wardrobe as well. Now I would say, tip number 4 here, transforming your hair and makeup and sort of your beauty look to the era that you're going for is gonna go a long way. Even if you're still wearing a very fusion of your modern clothes or what you already had before you start even building your vintage wardrobe, if you switch over to wearing vintage style makeup and hair, you are halfway to having a vintage style. It's a very distinct look. People You will get attention for it. People will ask you if you're in a play, which I always think is one of the best things, because it's like, why would I be all fully dressed in my costume out and about? You've obviously never worked for a wardrobe department. They don't let you just take the clothes out and about. But hair and makeup really make a huge difference in giving you a vintage style. It's like kind of remarkable how much that does for you. So what's great about that too is that it's inexpensive. You don't have to have Besame, you don't have to have vintage inspired makeup or hair tools. You can just get some cheap foam rollers and a red lipstick from Walgreens and you can get halfway there. And that's what I really think is great about vintage kind of glamour style, is that it's super accessible in that way. It's gonna take you time to learn how to do, you know, the perfect cat eye if that's what you're into, or setting your hair in a vintage way. But practice makes perfect, and there's really not as many setbacks for vintage beauty as there are for getting vintage style. Vintage clothes are expensive, vintage reproduction clothes are expensive. Sewing is a really good option, but not everyone knows how to sew. So maybe if you're learning or you don't want to learn how to sew, that could be a roadblock for you in vintage style. But buying lipstick and curling your hair, these are cheap things that can really take you half the way there to getting some vintage style. I think those 4 tips, kind of tips, are really going to take you a long way into how to start wearing vintage and styling your wardrobe in a more vintage way. Something that's kind of the next step, I think, other than just continuing to do research. I'm always doing research. I find it so much fun to go into 1940s catalogs or find new images that I haven't seen before. Research is still obviously a huge part of going forward once you start changing your style into vintage style. But another thing too, I think, is like the next level of vintage style, and if you want to be a little bit more accurate, is looking into vintage style undergarments and sort of getting that vintage silhouette from the ground up, as it were. So looking into maybe what Katie did or other reproduction lingerie brands. Bullet bras aren't like necessary, and you will get some strange looks if you wear vintage shaped shapewear, because people are just not used to seeing that silhouette on people anymore. But I feel like depending on what you're wearing, like, people won't notice too much, and it really does go well with the clothes. And you'll notice sometimes if you do start wearing vintage clothing that it's cut to wear with a girdle underneath or to wear with a bullet bra. So it's interesting to play with the shapewear that era had associated with it. It's just like kind of the next level in your vintage style, shaping up the silhouette underneath. So petticoats, bullet bras, all kinds of different vintage lingerie. Seamed stockings are another very like vintage look. Like, people recognize that as something out of the ordinary, something distinctly not modern. So some seam stockings are always nice. And these kind of things are a little bit more expensive, which is why I think it's easier to get into vintage style without really building on that kind of a foundation. Like, having the silhouette stuff for me definitely came later, when I wanted to kind of like step up my game, my vintage style game, and I added that silhouette stuff, which you would think it's a great base to start from. If you have the opportunity to build up from vintage shapewear or vintage inspired shapewear, it's a great place to build on top of. But it's also something you can add later when you maybe have more money saved up, or just more intention to have a more authentic look. So that's something that's kind of a next step. So those are my steps and tips on how to start wearing vintage inspired clothing and style. I think it's really fun, and it's definitely a little bit different. You might get some comments. That's another thing to keep in mind if you start wearing vintage style. People will probably make comments on it when you're out, or people like your friends and family might be a little weirded out at first, but you just gotta rock it and tell them, you know, whatever. This is what I like, and I'm gonna do it. So you do you, you know? There's no right or wrong way to have vintage inspired style. So don't let people tell you that your style is wrong because you're wearing reproduction, or because the stuff you have is thrifted and it looks vintage, or it's modern and you've made it look vintage. Like, any way you can get the look you're going for, whether that's modern clothes, thrifted clothes, stuff you made yourself, reproduction, or true vintage, it's all vintage style. Like, let's not, you know, everyone be nice and inclusive, and realize that not everyone can afford vintage. Vintage doesn't come in everyone's size, really, and it's quite rare. So, you know, a lot of us want to wear vintage style, and there's only so many vintage clothes out there. So don't let anyone get you down, and wear what you want, and kind of find your personal style within vintage. All vintage style is correct. There's no wrong way to wear vintage inspired style. Feel free to ask me any specific questions you have, maybe about starting to wear vintage style or where to find certain things. There are definitely brands that I've come to like love within the vintage reproduction or vintage adjacent sort of fashion lines out there, and that kind of stuff. I'm happy to share with you guys. So ask me any specific comments or questions you have down in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer them as well as I can. And thank you for watching today, you guys. I hope you have a great week ahead, and I'll see you soon. Bye! Should I move the plant? Should I move the plant? What is your opinion? I don't know. Yeah?